He was imprisoned in Egypt for 5 years. Having served 4 years as an Amnesty International adopted prisoner of conscience in Egypt, he is now a leading critic of his former Islamist ideology and dogmas, while remaining a Muslim. He is the co-founder and chairman of Gulam, a globally active think tank countering extremism. He is a parliamentarian candidate for the British general elections coming in May, and an honorary associate of the National Secular Society. And he is a well-regarded speaker on British and American television, and not surprisingly, as a former extremist himself, he knows what he is talking about. We wonder why certain European Muslims are attracted by the Islamist ideology. And I can imagine these questions are even more present in the minds of Muslims here in the Netherlands as well, and also worldwide. To what we do they belong? Maajid Nawaz is one of those courageous people who has done one of the most difficult things a man can do, change his mind. What changed his mind? How did he come to believe the political Islam was a solution, and how did he learn it was part of the problem? Can he give us a perspective on the mind of those that seek for the kalifaat under the rule of Sharia law? And can he give us an insight in what we can do to counter these ideas? The Dutch humanists are very pleased to give him the floor, Mr. Nawaz. May I invite you to have your lecture. Thank you so much. Good luck.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's wonderful to be here in Amsterdam and to see the response that this talk has resulted in. I want to thank all of you, first of all, for having the commitment and the courage to be here. And I say courage, and all of you up there as well, thank you for being here, because, you know, in this current climate, it is precisely in events like this that people feel uncomfortable. What happened in Copenhagen was unfortunately at a public event like this. So for you to come here and to vote with your feet and to insist that despite the intimidation that was referred to in the very kind introduction, despite the attempts of those who want to silence the debate, despite the wishes of those who would rather that this does not remain a conversation, but in fact moves to a conflict, we have all chosen by our very presence here to maintain this at the level of a conversation. And it's crucial that this conversation continues. In fact, it's the most important aspect of the situation we find ourselves in, that we must continue to be able to speak. And it is only through conversation that this debate will evolve. It is only through people brave such as you are, refusing to be cowered into silence and voting with your feet to continue endorsing this level of conversation. We were just speaking before this lecture in the green room about the importance of this conversation. Because if we shut the debate down, if we allow either ourselves to be silenced, or in fact if we become the tools that silence others, then of course what remains is the language of violence. And it's for that very reason that I have been making increasingly, some would say, suicidal gestures dedicated to the pursuance of this conversation. And one of those is an example, a year before the Charlie Hebdo attacks, where in the United Kingdom, I was on a TV debate, and the discussion, the conversation, was about the importance of people's rights. And there was a young Muslim lady in the audience who chose to cover her face with what we call the niqab, the face veil. And a man in the audience had said to her that the face veil offends him. And so I, being a liberal, intervened and said to this young man, listen, it may offend you, but actually this isn't France, it's the United Kingdom. And though I disagree vehemently with women covering their faces, unfortunately or fortunately, we have a liberal rule of law, and we cannot force a woman to uncover her face if she chooses to cover it. So I stuck up for her. But the trap was already laid. What happened next was that another young man at the front row opened his shirt and exposed a t-shirt he was wearing underneath. And of course, on this t-shirt was an image, a very bland, innocuous image, but nevertheless an image of a stick figure called J, standing for Jesus, saying hi to a stick figure called Mo. And the stick figure called Mo said, "How you doing?" That was the extent of the image. Now the young lady immediately turned and responded to this man who had just opened up his shirt on live television to show his t-shirt. She said, "You can't wear that, it offends me." So of course I intervened again. And I said, "Young lady, we've just defended your right to wear the face veil, even though it offends others in this audience. And by the same measure, this young man has the right to wear that t-shirt. And just as we cannot force you to uncover your face, though we may vehemently disagree with everything that symbolizes, because this is not France, it's the United Kingdom, you cannot tell him what to wear either. It's a quid pro quo." And then I said, "And I'm not offended because I believe that the very concept of God that you're espousing would be far greater. The very cry that the jihadists exploit when they kill the innocent. In Arabic, Allahu Akbar. What does that mean? Allahu Akbar in Arabic means God isn't just great. It means God is greatest, is greater than everything else. So surely God is greater than to take offense at a stick figure saying, 'How you doing?'" What happened next was that the BBC decided not to offend. And though they showed the woman with her face veil, that wasn't censored, they did cut the close-up of the young man with his t-shirt. Now, context is everything. When this was aired, it was the very month that I had successfully negotiated the departure of the head of the English Defence League, Tommy Robinson, from his organization. Within a stroke, the leader and the deputy leader of Europe's largest populist street protest movement lost its leader and deputy leader. All of a sudden, there were these street populist activists who were rather anti-Muslim in their sentiment, looking to me for guidance, because their former leader had told them I was a reasonable Muslim. And so, they began asking me why the BBC had edited this clip. Now, in a position where, of course, I was attempting to be reasonable, for the purposes of the wider context, where I was genuinely attempting to bring people out from the cold, this populist street movement, and demonstrate that there is a better way of doing things, I decided to tweet the image. And I tweeted the image with the words, "I am not offended at this cartoon. Allahu Akbar minhu. God is greater than to take offense at this." And within 24 hours, and then for the rest of the month, you can imagine what that led to. And of course it ended relatively okay, because I'm standing here a couple of years later in front of you, talking to you. One would imagine I'm still alive. The reason I took that decision to retweet the cartoon of this stick figure called Mo, and to say as a Muslim that I am not offended, that I refuse to take offense, is for why and how I began today. It's because conversation is crucial. And if there's one thing in this debate we must resist, it is the attempts of those who would wish to silence the debate. Now, in the course of that conversation, of course, we may get many things wrong. We may err in our use of language. We may offend others who take offense, and in their reaction they may offend us. But it's through this process of stumbling through this conversation that we will arrive at greater clarity as a process. We will arrive at a way in which we can have this conversation. And then we can have progress. But what we mustn't allow is what I have jokingly began referring to with a level of seriousness as the Voldemort effect. If anyone's read Harry Potter. The Voldemort effect. What is the Voldemort effect? Well, of course, there is a bad guy in Harry Potter that nobody recognizes is still alive. And the denial that Voldemort still lives reaches to such a level of hysteria that it's prohibited to call his name. So Voldemort begins being referred to in the collection of, I've read all the books, by the way, as he who must not be named. And whenever Harry Potter, who is, him and Albus Dumbledore, are the only people originally who are able to say Voldemort because they acknowledge he's still alive and they believe that we must refer to this by name so that we humanize him, that we lessen the fear. So they refer to him by name, the conversation is shut down instantly. And instead a hysterical reaction is engendered because people are too scared to have the conversation. And it results in an irrational, hysterical reaction whenever the name Voldemort is mentioned. Now, the dangers of that in the real world, I'm sorry to break your hearts, but Harry Potter isn't real. The dangers of that in the real world, when applying to Islamism, are indeed very real. Because if we can't have this conversation, if we cannot even name what we're dealing with, then the same, similar, analogous levels of hysteria emerge. And I want to be very precise in what I say next. In particular, among my own kind, and what I mean by my own kind is Europe's progressives. I'm a parliamentary candidate for the Liberal Democrats in the United Kingdom. And when I say my own kind, I mean those on the left, the centre left, and the progressive liberals. The dangers are in an attempt from fear of offending minority communities. When we shut this debate down, the hysteria that results primarily impacts those very same minority communities we were attempting to save. Why? Because if we cannot name what we're dealing with, and if we cannot have a sensible and rational conversation, the only thing that is left is hysteria, and hysteria leads to irrational reaction, and a result of irrational reaction is more racism, more prejudice, and more violence. Not less. If we cannot name what we're talking about, then all Muslims are inherently suspicious. That's what I call the Voldemort effect, and it is very serious. And so for all of those on the center-left and the progressive side of this debate, we are not doing this debate any favors if we shy away from the conversation, or if we obfuscate, or if we use vague, generalized language from fear of offending minority communities, because that vague and generalized language, such as, oh, it's an extremist ideology, unless we specify we are talking about Islamist extremist ideology as distinct from a religion, then the extremist ideology in that vague language we refer to, populist discourse will capitalize upon that and say, yes, extremist ideology, that's Islam. The religion of Islam is the extremist ideology. So the progressives will end up doing the populists' work for them. So that's a bit about the importance of the conversation and the importance of using language that names what we're talking about, and only then will we be able to move forward. I want to tell you a bit about a different type of conversation. And that's how I ended up, at the age of 16, having a very different conversation. And that was the ideological Islamist conversation that led to me joining Hizb ut-Tahrir. That's how you pronounce it. Now, let me start at the end. A couple of years ago, I was in the Prime Minister's private residence at Chequers. And Morsi, the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, was president of Egypt. Well, he was appointed by the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood to be president of Egypt. The Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary and various others called me in for my advice on what the British government's relationship to Egypt should be. And as part of this process, they called the official spokesman for the Egyptian government, who was the Muslim Brotherhood's official spokesman, who flew all the way to come and speak to the Prime Minister and to the Foreign Secretary. What was cathartic about that meeting is that only a few years prior, I wouldn't have been sitting in Chequers, advising the PM on what the relationship should be with the Egyptian government, with the Muslim Brotherhood in charge, and with Hosni Mubarak in the very prison cell that he held me in Egypt. But it would have been me in the prison cell. And that's the journey I've come here to speak to you about. How does somebody who was, prior to that, as an Islamist in the very jail cells of Egypt, end up advising the Prime Minister about what to do with the former president who put him in those jail cells? And before I go on, I just would like to tell you that the name of this spokesperson that was sent by the Muslim Brotherhood government in Egypt to come and meet with the Prime Minister, if you have a guess, was rather unfortunate, considering it was a Muslim Brotherhood government. The official spokesman for the Muslim Brotherhood government of Egypt was received by the Prime Minister as Jihad. Al-Haddad. That's actually his name. No, that's actually his real name. So we're sitting there, and we had the Foreign Secretary, we had the PM, and in walks Mr. Prime Minister. This is Jihad, the official spokesman for the Muslim Brotherhood. He's come to talk to you about cordial relationships with. And he says, "Hello, Mr. Prime Minister, I'm Jihad." But we had a serious conversation, and I suppose the question is, how did I end up in that position? And this story begins 20 years prior, being born and raised in Essex. I came of age during the genocide in Bosnia. I came of age during a time in the United Kingdom, a year before the murder of Stephen Lawrence, which became a flagship case for domestic racism in the UK. I came of age when domestic racism in the UK was at its peak, violent, aggressive racism. And across the borders, the genocide against Muslims in Bosnia was playing out. Now, for me, this was a rude awakening. Up until that point, I really hadn't considered my religious identity. I had considered myself an agnostic. Some of you may wish to thank my mother for that. But the genocide in Bosnia and the violent hammer attacks and machete attacks that we were facing on the streets of Essex led me to question. And I often say that in the process of radicalization, grievances are one of the many factors that lead to it. They are not the only factor, and they are insufficient in and of themselves as an agent of radicalization, but they are a factor. Human beings are not like water. We don't all freeze at 0 degrees Celsius and all boil at 100 degrees Celsius. We react to social situations in different ways. So when having this conversation, and it is important we're having this conversation, it's important to recognize that people bring their own ideological predisposition when interpreting the process of radicalization. They bring their confirmation bias with them. Those who tend towards the left wing, they seek for grievances and racism and poverty in explaining radicalization. And those who come from the right wing, they seek not just ideology, but the religion of Islam itself as a factor. When actually the truth is it's the way in which all of these blend in together in a human being. So for me, with the Bosnia genocide playing out and with the domestic racism at home, I happened to come across a charismatic recruiter who was able to exploit a third factor here, which was my detachment in identity terms, my crisis as to questioning whether I was British or whether I was Pakistani or indeed whether I was Muslim. So here we have three factors already. A sense of grievance, whether real or perceived, it doesn't really matter at this stage. And an identity crisis that is caused by that, and then a charismatic recruiter who's able to provide a sense of belonging. And then, of course, the final element, an ideological narrative that the charismatic recruiter is responsible for imparting. When the way in which those four interacted with me led me to joining this organization at the age of 16. And a brief explanation as to what Hizb ut-Tahrir believes in. It was the first global Islamist organization that was responsible for popularizing the notion of resurrecting this theocratic caliphate. But Islamism, like communism, has divisions within it in terms of how to come to power. So just as with communism, you have those who are the Leninists, those who are the Marxists, you have Che Guevara and his militants. Islamism has a similar divisions within it. And so, of course, you have the Muslim Brotherhood Islamists who work with government and within government to attempt to bring about their ideology. And then you have the former group that I used to belong to, the revolutionary Islamists, who attempt to bring about this caliphate via a military coup, not via democracy. Or should I say more accurately, not via elections. And then, thirdly, you have the militants, who attempt to use direct violence. And you had these same divisions within communism. But they essentially agree, all of them, on one thing. They agree on one basic idea, which is the one-sentence definition of Islamism, which I'll give to you for the purposes of this conversation. And that is, what is Islamism? The desire to impose any version of Islam over society. That desire to impose any given version of the religion over society is what I refer to as Islamism, as distinct from somebody who may happen to be a conservative religious Muslim. A bit like, you've got the Amish in America. Conservative and religious in their own, within their own communities, but has no political desire to impose that conservative religious interpretation over the rest of society. And that, for me, is the key difference between Islamism and whichever version of Islam anyone may happen to follow. So I subscribed to a revolutionary variety of that Islamism at the age of 16 and became very active within this movement. I left my hometown, I moved to London. I joined a college, Newham College, where I became elected as president of the student union and where my entire student union leadership were activists of this organization as well. And our purpose was to recruit. And we poisoned the atmosphere to such an extent on this campus that eventually, unfortunately, one of my supporters, who wasn't a member of my group, but had subscribed to the ideas, ended up murdering someone on this campus by stabbing them through the heart with a machete. That was in 1995, I think, and was perhaps London's first jihadist street murder. But it's important to note here that it wasn't interpreted as London's first jihadist street murder. It was interpreted as a street fight, as gang crime. And this is why I want to pause just for 1 second here. That part of the problem throughout the 90s decade is that society simply wasn't equipped in recognizing what was going on. And where there was crime, it was ascribed to generalized criminal motives. All the while, there was an ideological undercurrent that was playing up, that was patronized. And I was a direct recipient of this patronage. This undercurrent, this ideological undercurrent, was patronized by progressives as a Muslim political awakening. Now, I don't know about you, but if in any other version of any other society, in any other scenario, Let's take Weimar Republic before World War II. If you see the rise of fascism, that's not a German political awakening. Because, of course, a political awakening could be socialist, it could be liberal, it could be many things. And so when Islamism began rising within London in the 1990s, it was too simplistic and too neo-Orientalist to ascribe this to a general Muslim political awakening. But that's what happened. And so for the course of the 90s, that was left unchecked. Though I was expelled from the college, I was expelled because of my association with the murderer, not because of the dangers of the rise of the Islamist ideology. The president of the student union and the entire student union committee were expelled, but this didn't deter me from my activities. So I continued propagating the Islamist ideology. That eventually led me to Pakistan in 1999. And the reason I went, in fact I was sent by my leadership, is because in 1998 Pakistan had tested an atomic bomb. And my organization that wanted to resurrect this caliphate via a military coup decided what better place to create a caliphate than a nuclear country where this caliphate would have a nuclear bomb. And the jihad it declares would be a nuclear jihad. So we went in 1999, a group of us, to co-found from Britain. The United Kingdom exported caliphate theocratic ideology from the United Kingdom to Pakistan. We were the first to arrive and the first group to popularize the notion of resurrecting a caliphate in Pakistan. Of course, there were the Taliban. But let me tell you for a fact, the Taliban that were in Pakistan at that time were focused on the war in Afghanistan. They considered Pakistan an Islamic nation. They had no war with Pakistan. I know because I met with Taliban commanders in an attempt to convince them that Pakistan is what we labeled Dar al-Harb, the land of war, and the caliphate must be established and this government must be overthrown in Pakistan itself. And at the time, you believe it or not, Taliban commanders were disagreeing with me. But that's how the debate shifted over the course of the decade that followed. Once my work there was done, I spent a year there. I then returned to the UK. I was in university at this time at SOAS studying law and Arabic. And from SOAS, I would study Monday to Friday and then fly out on the weekends to Copenhagen to found the Danish-Pakistani branch of this organization. And eventually, one day before the 9/11 attacks, I arrived in Egypt, ostensibly for the third year of my Arabic degree, but also to revive and resurrect the Egyptian branch of this organization. Now, of course, the security climate changed in Egypt after the 9/11 attacks. And one thing that I hadn't predicted was just how it would change. And so on the 1st of April in 2002, my house was raided in Alexandria in Cairo. My hands were tied behind my back with rags. I was blindfolded, and I was taken to the dungeons of Egypt's state security headquarters in Cairo, to a building known as Al-Gihaz. There we were taken underground and we were numbered. My number was 42, but the numbers went into their hundreds. And the Egyptian state security proceeded to roll call everyone in this dungeon in chronological order. They started with number 1. And then they frog marched number 1, blindfolded, to the interrogation room, stripped number 1 naked, pinned him down to the floor with a chair, and began to torture number 1 on the teeth and genitalia via electrocution. We would listen to number 1 scream, and then number 2 was called, and they did the same to number 2. And then number 3 was called, and they did the same to number 3. And so on and so forth until 41, which was the chap sitting to my left. We were stuffed like sardines in the corridors because it was overflowing, so we were on top of each other. I remember number 41 weeping like a baby as his turn was called up next, having just listened to 40 people before him tortured by electrocution. I remember attempting to console number 41, whose identity remains a mystery to me until today, because I could not see him. I remember reading passages of the Quran to attempt to console him and to lend him some courage. But number one was sure enough marched to his torture, and I had to listen to number 41 scream as they electrocuted him. And then my number 42 was called. Somehow, I managed to walk to the interrogation room, guided by the supporting arm of my enemy, the jailers. I remember standing there in the rags because they'd run out of handcuffs. That's how many people they had in these dungeons. The rags came undone from behind me. And I remember vowing there and then that rather than face the humiliation, pain, and indignity of torture, I would rather die. So I decided that if they did electrocute me, that I would attack them in the hope that they killed me. Because my hands were free. Till this day, I don't know why, though I suspect, instead of electrocuting me, they brought the other British Muslim who was with me, and they electrocuted him in front of me, and asked us questions and played our answers off each other. I was then given 1 extra day and told that if I didn't cooperate, the same would happen to me. The very next day, we were surprised to be taken away from the torture facility. This is 4 days later, because the British Embassy had been making inquiries. And instead, we were put into solitary confinement in Mazra'at prison in Cairo, which is the jail that eventually held Hosni Mubarak, to take you back to the beginning of this story. He was in the same cells that he held us in after this ordeal. Mazra'at prison, in the row of solitary cells in the Mulhaq wing of that prison. And there we dwelt for 4 months without toilets and without sanitation, the toilet being the floor, and the floor also being our bed. After 4 months, we were charged, and we were released to the general population of the prison. And eventually we were convicted. The conviction, a political conviction, even under Egyptian law, was for membership of a banned organization, and we were sentenced to 5 years in prison. At which point, to my surprise, Amnesty International adopted us as prisoners of conscience. And Amnesty took the view that I took with the young lady wearing the face veil on that TV show. Amnesty took the view that we disagree vehemently with what this man says and with what he stands for. But because he has not used violence and because he has not advocated the use of violence directly, we will defend his right to be an extremist. And Amnesty began campaigning for my release. I was 24 years old. I'm now 24 and a half. Amnesty's work for my release was the first time in my up until then young life that I'd come across people that I defined as the enemy defending my rights. Now, it's difficult for us to sometimes think of it in this way. But if you're coming of age during a time when there's a genocide unfolding on your continent against people who, even though you didn't identify as one of them, others would force you to identify as one of them. Let's remember the Bosnians were being identified as Muslims and being killed. Whether I was religious or not, I feared I would be identified as a Muslim and be killed. Now, in the context where my friends are being stabbed and hit round the heads with hammers, and I'm being held back and being forced to watch as they're stabbing my friends, you can see that's not too difficult a conclusion to come to. So, in my up until then very young life, this was the first time people that I defined as my enemy began systematically campaigning for my release. And lucky for me, not lucky for anyone else, lucky for me, that touched me deeply. It had a profound impact on my heart. And I've said in my book, where the heart leads, the mind can follow. And I began interacting with the human rights discourse. Having been a law student, I became fascinated with this thing called human rights. I began studying it, reading about it. I began corresponding with members of Amnesty International. But importantly, I began debating with the other political prisoners. I had in there with me in Mazra'atul prison the leaders, the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, Dr. Muhammad Badir. I had the assassins of Anwar Sadat from Egyptian Jihad, and I had the leader of Hizb ut-Tahrir and many others with whom I began debating. And over the course of the 5 years, I realized one thing. I obviously read and reread George Orwell's Animal Farm. And I realized one thing, that if this so-called caliphate that we're working for ever comes about, the result would be a system, a regime, a society that would be 10 times worse than the dictators we were attempting to overthrow. It would be hell on earth. The realization of a dystopic vision. Because I realized that in any attempt to create the perfect society or to socially engineer society with a dogma leads to nothing but oppression. And one of the reasons I realized that is I was living among the people who were meant to be the cream of the crop of this ideology. They were controlling the jail cells. And I saw and lived among how they managed their own system in the prisons. And I thought, my God, if these people ever come to power, if they ever declare this caliphate, it will be hell on earth. So I took the decision after my release from prison in 2006, 10 months after, roughly, to sort of give you a time zone, I took the decision that I could no longer subscribe to the Islamist ideology. And there was a long process over the course of 5 years that led to that, which we could perhaps talk about later. But essentially, I thought, if this caliphate's ever created, it will be a nightmare. And I'm very happy I came to that conclusion, because events subsequently in Syria and Iraq have demonstrated what happens when people attempt to create the perfect society in their declaration of a caliphate. What was left for me to do was simple. And before I carry on, and check the time for you all so I don't overrun. What was left for me to do was take responsibility, to try and fix some of what I had a role in spreading. Now, part of doing that was to set up Quilliam as an organization that works as a counter-extremism think tank. Part of it was to begin to challenge the extremist ideology. But what I'd like to do, actually, is leave you with the framework I've been working towards rather than the details of what I've been doing, because I think the framework is more important. Why this ideological phenomenon was so attractive to me, due to the combination of the grievances, the identity crisis, the charismatic recruiter, and the ideology. Why this was so attractive to me is down to 5 elements that we need to be aware of. And that was, effectively, what we had was a brand for resistance. Resistance against the establishment, but also resistance against dictators in the Arab world. And that brand is comprised of ideas, in this case, the desire to implement a version of Islam over society. Narratives, which is the propaganda for these ideas, such as there's a war going on against Islam and Muslims and we must defend ourselves. So we've got ideas, we've got narratives, we had leaders that we could look up to. People, that came to symbolize what this struggle meant. And we had iconography or symbolism, things like the black flag. This was the symbolism around this idea. And we had a dream to dream. That's the 5 elements. The dream was the resurrection of the caliphate. Now, if I go through a thought experiment with you to end on this note, those 5 have become a brand that attracts young people to a group identity, to a sense of belonging in a certain phenomenon. And it's very easy for us to conjure up each one of those 5 for the Islamist movement across the world. We know what their ideas are, what their narratives are. We know who their leaders are. We can think of them instantly. Bin Laden's face is still etched in our memories. We know what their iconography is. We know the symbolism. We know this ubiquitous black flag. And we know their dream of resurrecting a caliphate. But if I ask you to think of these 5 now for democratic activism in the Middle East, what are their ideas and their narratives? Who are their leaders? What is the symbol of democratic activism in the Middle East? And what is the Arab democrat's dream? General Sisi? Saudi Arabia? What is the end goal that we're asking young Arabs to work towards? Because on the one hand, you've got a complete package that tells them that we will create this caliphate. On the other hand, there is nothing to dream, there's no one to follow, there is no symbolism to admire, and the ideas and the narratives are bankrupt. And instead, we have rehashed this old false dichotomy that the solution to the Middle East's problems are either theocracy or dictatorship. And what we so desperately need is for there to be that democratic ideas and narratives and leaders and symbols and the democratic dream. What that will look like, how that can come about, what shape it takes, I will leave to the debate and to the interview and to the questions and the answers and the criticisms. Thank you for your patience.